Margaret Elaine Voss had spent the better part of her adult life learning how to become invisible. Not in a magical sense, but in the quiet and practiced way that working-class women often do when they spend their days inside homes that do not belong to them. She knew how to move through a room without disturbing the air, how to fold a linen napkin into a perfect triangle without being asked twice, and how to answer a question with just enough words to satisfy the person asking without drawing any unnecessary attention to herself. She had been a domestic worker for over 14 years, and in those 14 years, she had served in 7 different households across the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Each one had its own rhythms, its own demands, and its own way of reminding her that she was there to serve and not to be seen. When she accepted the position at the Hargrove estate in the spring of that year, she told herself it would be like all the others. The pay was better than average, the house was large but manageable, and the previous housekeeper had left on good terms, which was always a sign that the environment was at least livable. What she had not fully prepared herself for was Richard Hargrove himself. Richard Hargrove was 53 years old, the kind of man who had never truly earned anything but had convinced himself that he had earned everything. He had inherited a commercial real estate company from his father, expanded it modestly through a team of talented employees he rarely acknowledged by name, and used the resulting wealth to build a life that revolved entirely around the performance of success. He drove cars that were meant to be seen, wore watches that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and hosted dinner parties where the guest list mattered far more than the conversation. He was not a cruel man in the violent sense of the word, but he carried a particular kind of cruelty that is far more common and in many ways more damaging. He was the type who diminished people with a look, with a tone, with the casual carelessness of someone who had never once considered that the people around him had full and complicated lives of their own. Margaret noticed it in her first week. It was nothing dramatic at first, just small things that added up quietly the way small things always do. He would speak to her without looking at her. He would leave his bedroom in deliberate disorder and then make a comment about standards when she was still in the middle of cleaning it. Once, when she politely informed him that the dry cleaning he had asked her to collect would not be ready until Thursday, he let out a short laugh and said, in front of 2 of his colleagues who had stopped by the house, that he supposed he should not expect too much. His colleagues laughed along with him. Margaret said nothing. She smiled the way she had learned to smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes, and she went back to what she was doing. What Richard Hargrove did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Margaret Elaine Voss had grown up playing the piano. She had started at the age of 6 in a small church in Columbia where her grandmother was the choir director. By the time she was 12, she was accompanying the adult choir during Sunday services. By 16, she had won 2 regional youth competitions and been offered a partial scholarship to a music conservatory in Georgia. She had not taken the scholarship because her mother had gotten sick that same year and someone had to stay home. And Margaret had always been the kind of person who stayed. Life had rerouted her the way it reroutes so many people who are talented and responsible and female, and without the luxury of choosing only themselves. She had set the music aside, not abandoned it. Just set it down carefully the way you set down something precious when your hands are suddenly needed for something else. The Hargrove estate had a piano. It sat in the far east wing of the house in a sitting room that Richard rarely used. It was a Steinway grand, deep black, and clearly expensive, though from the state of its keys it had not been played in a very long time. Margaret dusted it every week as part of her routine. She would run the cloth along its edges, wipe down the fallboard, and sometimes, when the house was empty, and the afternoon light was falling through the tall windows in that particular golden way that made everything feel a little more forgiving, she would sit down on the bench and rest her hands on the keys without pressing them. She was not sure why she held herself back. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was the deep-trained sense that the things in this house, including the space inside it, did not belong to her. But one afternoon in early October, something shifted. Richard had left for a 3-day trip to Atlanta for a conference. The estate was quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Margaret had finished her work for the day, and the late sun was doing that thing again with the windows, and she sat down at the Steinway as she always did, but this time her hands did not stop at the surface of the keys. They pressed down, and the sound that came out of that piano was not tentative or uncertain. It was full and warm and deeply, deeply confident, the sound of someone who had never actually forgotten a single thing. She played for almost an hour that afternoon, moving through pieces she had not performed in years, but that lived in her hands the way certain things live in the body long after the mind has stopped paying attention to them. She played a Chopin nocturne that her grandmother had loved, then shifted into a gospel arrangement she had written herself as a teenager, then drifted into something that was neither classical nor gospel, but somewhere in between. The kind of music that happens when a person stops thinking about what they are playing and simply plays. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the room felt different, warmer somehow and more alive. She sat there for a moment in the settling silence, then stood, closed the fallboard gently, and went home as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had happened. Something had been unlocked inside her that was not willing to go back behind the door. She returned to the piano the following afternoon after her work was done, and the afternoon after that. She was always careful. She always finished every task first, always made sure the house was in order, always listened for any sound that might signal an early return. She was not doing anything wrong, but she knew how it would look to a man like Richard Hargrove, and she had no interest in giving him a reason to see her as anything other than exactly what she was hired to be. So she played quietly, or as quietly as a Steinway grand would allow, and she gave herself those late afternoon hours the way a person gives themselves something they have been denying for far too long. Richard returned from Atlanta on a Thursday evening, 2 hours earlier than expected. Margaret had already left for the day, so he came home to an empty house. He went to his study, poured himself a drink, and sat down at his desk to go through emails. He would not think about the piano until the following Saturday, when he hosted his monthly dinner gathering, a curated event he organized 4 times a year for a rotating group of business associates, minor local politicians, and people he considered culturally important to know. These dinners followed a formula that Richard had refined over the years. Good wine, catered food from the restaurant downtown that everyone recognized, and the right kind of conversation that made everyone feel they were part of something exclusive. He had mentioned to his guests, in the casual way that wealthy people mention things they consider beneath detailed explanation, that he employed a housekeeper who handled the preparation for these evenings. Margaret had spent the entire day before the dinner polishing surfaces, arranging flowers, pressing tablecloths, and coordinating with the catering team that arrived in the late afternoon. She stayed through the early part of the evening to ensure the first course was served smoothly, as was standard for her role. Richard did not introduce her to his guests. He acknowledged her only once when he needed the serving platter repositioned, and he did so by snapping his fingers in her direction while continuing his sentence to the man seated beside him. One of the guests noticed. Her name was Diane Acaffer, a woman in her mid-40s who ran a nonprofit arts organization in the city and had known Richard through mutual connections for several years. She caught Margaret's eye after the finger snap and offered a small, quiet look that managed to say both "I saw that" and "I am sorry" in the same breath. Margaret gave her the same practiced smile she always gave and continued her work. It was Diane who, later in the evening, wandered away from the dining room and into the east wing while looking for the restroom. She found herself instead standing in the doorway of the sitting room, looking at the Steinway. She was drawn to it the way people who love music are always drawn to instruments, with a kind of reverence that is almost involuntary. She walked over to it and ran her fingers lightly along the top. Then she noticed something that Richard had never bothered to notice in all the years he had owned it. The piano was not just clean. It was tuned. She pressed a few keys experimentally and heard immediately the difference between an instrument that is merely maintained and one that is being actively loved. Someone had been playing this piano and playing it seriously. She mentioned it to Richard when she returned to the table, the way you mention something interesting without fully knowing why. She told him that his piano sounded wonderful, that it was clearly being kept in beautiful condition, and she asked if he played. Richard laughed the way he laughed at things that he found slightly absurd and told her he had not touched that piano in 3 years, that it had come with the house when he renovated the wing, and that it was essentially decorative at this point. Diane looked at him with the carefully neutral expression of someone filing away a piece of information for later, and said that was a shame. Because the piano sounded like it had been played very recently, and by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. Richard did not respond to this directly, but something behind his eyes shifted, and later that night, after the guests had gone and the catering team had packed up and left, he walked into the east wing alone and stood in front of the Steinway in the dark. He pressed one key, then another. He was not musical and had never pretended to be, but even he could hear that what came out of those keys was rich and resonant and precisely calibrated. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went back to his study, sat down, and began to think about who exactly had been sitting at his piano. He did not ask Margaret directly the next morning. That was not his style. Richard Hargrove was the kind of man who preferred to gather information before deploying it, who liked to know the full shape of a situation before he decided what to do with it. So instead he watched. He paid attention in the particular way that people pay attention when they feel that something in their environment has shifted without their permission. He noticed the way she moved through the east wing when she cleaned it, whether she paused near the piano, whether her hands lingered anywhere they should not. He told himself he was simply being observant. What he was actually doing was looking for something to confirm a suspicion that already irritated him before he had even proven it true. It took him 4 days. He came home in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, earlier than Margaret had any reason to expect, having cut short a lunch meeting downtown. He let himself in through the side entrance off the garage, the one that opened into the kitchen hallway, and he stood still for a moment in the quiet of the house. Then he heard it. Music moving through the corridors from the east wing, low and full and unhurried, the kind of playing that does not announce itself but simply fills whatever space it occupies. He set his keys down on the kitchen counter without making a sound and followed it. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room for nearly 2 full minutes before Margaret heard him. She was deep inside the music, playing something slow and searching that moved between a minor and a major key in a way that felt like a conversation the music was having with itself. Her posture at the bench was nothing like the posture she carried through the rest of the house. At work she was compact, efficient, careful with the space she took up. At the piano she was open, her shoulders settled back, her head slightly tilted, her whole body organized around the sound she was making. She looked in that moment like an entirely different person, or perhaps more accurately, she looked like the full version of the person she actually was. When she finally sensed the presence in the doorway and turned, the music stopped so abruptly that the silence felt almost loud. She stood up from the bench immediately, and the expression that crossed her face in that first half-second was not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The instinctive flinching of someone who has been caught taking up space they were not certain they were allowed to occupy. She straightened and said his name and began to explain that she had finished all of her work for the day, that everything on her list had been completed, and that she had simply sat down for a moment. Richard let her finish. Then he looked at her with an expression that managed to be both calm and cutting, and said that the piano was not part of her job description. He said it the way he said most things that were meant to diminish, with a kind of measured pleasantness that made the words harder to push back against, because they were delivered without obvious heat. He told her that the instrument was expensive and delicate and that he would appreciate it if she limited her contact with it to cleaning. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The message was precisely what he intended it to be, which was that she had overstepped, that she had mistaken his home for somewhere she had rights, and that he was now correcting that misunderstanding. Margaret said yes, she understood, and she picked up her bag and left. She drove home in a state that was not quite anger and not quite sadness but carried elements of both. She had been working for other people long enough to know that moments like this one were part of the territory, that men like Richard Hargrove existed in every tax bracket but were most concentrated at the top, and that the most dignified response was usually silence followed by distance. She thought about giving notice. She sat with that thought for most of the evening, turning it over, weighing it against the practical reality of her finances, her mother's ongoing medical costs, the apartment lease that renewed in 3 months. She decided she would stay and she would do her job and she would not sit at the piano again. She had managed 14 years without it. She could manage the rest of this contract. What she did not account for was Diane Ockhoffer. Diane had thought about the piano intermittently since the dinner party. She had also thought about Margaret, about the finger snap, about the small quiet look they had exchanged. She had spent enough of her professional life working in art spaces to recognize the particular energy of someone who was genuinely musical. And something about the woman she had watched move through Richard's dining room had stayed with her in a way she could not entirely explain. On the Wednesday after the dinner, she called Richard on an unrelated matter, and at the end of the call mentioned casually that she had been thinking about his piano and had wondered whether he had ever considered hosting a small musical gathering at the estate, something intimate and cultured that his regular crowd would enjoy. Richard, who was always receptive to anything that elevated the image of his home, said he thought that was an interesting idea and asked her what she had in mind. What Diane had in mind was more specific than she let on in that initial conversation. Over the following week, she made a few quiet inquiries, spoke to the catering company that had worked Richard's dinner, and through a small and somewhat winding chain of connections, learned that the housekeeper at the Hargrove estate was named Margaret Voss. And then through a musician friend of a friend, learned something about who Margaret Voss had been before life redirected her. What she learned made her sit back in her chair and look at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone again, and this time she called Richard with a more complete proposal. She suggested an evening gathering, something more artistic than his usual dinners, with a live piano performance as the centerpiece. She told him she knew of a performer who she believed would be perfect for the setting and for the crowd he typically assembled, someone local and genuinely gifted whose story would resonate with his guests. Richard asked who the performer was. Diane paused for exactly 1 beat and then told him the name. The silence on Richard's end of the line lasted longer than he intended it to. He told Diane he would think about it. He spent the better part of that evening telling himself the idea was absurd, that it would be awkward, that it made no sense to invite his housekeeper to perform at a gathering in his own home. But the more he turned it over, the more he found that his objections had less to do with practicality, and more to do with something he was not entirely comfortable examining directly. He was not used to being surprised by the people who worked for him. He was not used to the particular discomfort of having underestimated someone in his own house, in his own space, using his own instrument. He had looked at Margaret Voss for weeks and seen only what he expected to see. The fact that what he had expected to see was so dramatically incomplete was not something he knew how to place comfortably inside his understanding of himself. He called Diane back the following morning and told her to go ahead and extend the invitation. Margaret received the invitation through Diane directly, which was deliberate on Diane's part. She had understood instinctively that delivering it through Richard would have made it feel like an order rather than an opportunity, and Margaret deserved to receive it as the latter. Diane called her on a Friday evening, introduced herself properly, explained how she had come to know about her background, and then laid out the proposal in full. She was warm and direct, and made it clear that the decision belonged entirely to Margaret, that there was no pressure and no obligation, and that she simply wanted her to know the door was open. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after Diane finished speaking. She was standing in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the window in front of her showing the last pale light of the evening settling over the rooftops of her neighborhood. She thought about the sitting room in the East Wing. She thought about the afternoon light through those tall windows and the way the Steinway had felt under her hands after so many years of absence. She thought about Richard Hargrove snapping his fingers in her direction while finishing a sentence meant for someone else. She thought about her grandmother, who had always told her that a gift unused is a gift returned, and not in a gracious way. She told Diane yes. She spent the 2 weeks before the gathering preparing with a seriousness and focus that reminded her of who she had been at 16, before life had asked her to put that person carefully aside. She practiced in the evenings at the church 2 blocks from her apartment, where the choir director was an old friend who gave her access to the upright piano in the rehearsal room without question. She selected her program with care, choosing pieces that moved across different registers of emotion and technique, that would show range without being showy, that would speak to people who knew music and to people who simply felt it. She was not nervous in the way that produces doubt. She was nervous in the way that produces precision. The evening of the gathering arrived on a Saturday in late November. Diane had curated the guest list herself, keeping it small and intentional, around 30 people seated in the East Wing sitting room on chairs arranged in a gentle arc around the Steinway. The room had been prepared beautifully, with soft lighting and flowers and the particular atmosphere that good rooms take on when they are arranged with genuine care. Margaret arrived earlier than the guests, as she always did, though this time she was not there to set out linens or coordinate with a catering team. She was there to sit with the instrument for a while before anyone else arrived, to let her hands remember where they were. Richard was present when she walked in through the front entrance for the first time as something other than an employee. He was standing near the hallway that led to the East Wing, and he watched her come through the door in a way that was different from how he had ever watched her before, though he would have had difficulty articulating precisely what had changed. She was wearing a deep blue dress and her hair was arranged simply, and she carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that the uniform of her working days had never quite concealed, but that was now entirely unobstructed. He said good evening. She returned the greeting with a composure that gave him nothing extra and moved past him toward the sitting room. When the guests were seated and the room had settled into that particular anticipatory hush that precedes live music, Margaret walked to the piano bench, adjusted it without hurry, and placed her hands on the keys. She did not look out at the audience before she began. She simply began. What came out of the Steinway in the first 30 seconds of her opening piece silenced the room in a way that was almost physical. It was not just that she was technically accomplished, though she was, it was that the music she made carried genuine weight. The kind of weight that only comes from a life that has known both loss and endurance and has found a way to hold both of them without bitterness. She moved through her program with the ease of someone who has returned to their native language after years of speaking in translation. The guests were still in their chairs in the way that people become still when something true is happening in front of them, not politely attentive but genuinely arrested, their bodies leaning forward without their awareness. Diane watched from the side of the room. She watched the guests, but she also watched Richard. He was seated near the back, and his expression across the course of that performance underwent a series of changes that he clearly had no strategy for managing, Because no one develops a strategy for the specific experience of being unmade by their own assumptions in a room full of people they have spent years trying to impress. He had spent weeks looking at this woman and seeing a function. What he was seeing now was a person of such depth and skill and interior richness that the contrast with how he had treated her was not something he could avoid or minimize or reframe. It simply sat in front of him, as clear and as unignorable as the music itself. When Margaret played her final piece, a gospel arrangement that built slowly from something intimate and spare into something vast and full and luminous, several people in the room had tears on their faces. When she finished and lifted her hands, the applause began immediately and did not stop for a long time. She stood and turned and received it without false modesty and without performance, just a woman accepting what had always belonged to her. Richard Hargrove clapped along with everyone else. But at some point during that applause, when Margaret's eyes moved across the room and met his briefly and moved on with the same calm steadiness they had always carried, something in him understood that the acknowledgement he was offering her now, however genuine it had become, was years overdue. The music had not humbled him, she had. She had done it simply by being exactly who she was, fully and without apology, in a house that had tried to make her smaller than that. After the guests had gone and the room was quiet again, Diane found Margaret near the piano gathering her things. She told her the performance had been extraordinary. Margaret thanked her and meant it. On his way out of the room, Richard stopped a few feet away and stood for a moment. He said her name. She looked at him. He told her that she played beautifully, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something stripped of its usual coating. It was not enough to account for all the small and large ways he had diminished her. She knew that, and he likely knew it too. But she accepted the words with the same grace she had brought to everything else that evening, not because he deserved her grace, but because she had long since decided that how she moved through the world belonged to her and not to whoever happened to be watching. She walked out of the Hargrove estate that night the same woman who had walked in every morning for months, except that nothing was hidden anymore, and she had no intention of hiding it again.